What is the purpose of life? The purpose of life is to realize God. The purpose of life is to realize Brahma, Allah, Dharmakaya, the I am that I am. The purpose of life is not to become God, because gods you are right now. Because gods you have been always, and gods you will be forever and ever. And there is nothing, absolutely nothing, that you could have ever possibly done. And there is nothing, absolutely nothing, that you could ever possibly do that could ever possibly change the truth of your identity. You are incarnations of God, and you are expressions of the Almighty One, whether you know it or not, and whether you believe it or not, and whether you like it or not. Your Creator has given you free will and free choice to think and to believe and to do whatever you want, but there is actually one thing where you do not have free will in regards to, and that concerns your identity. You are each expressions of Brahma, of Allah, of Dharmakaya, of the I am that I am, and you don't have a free will in regards to your identity, because God, Brahma, Allah, Dharmakaya, the I am that I am, created you, and you didn't create yourself. And so, what that means is that you each are absolutely divine and absolutely beautiful and absolutely amazing and absolutely valuable. And so what that means actually is that this gathering here is top-notch. And even better than that, not just is every person in this auditorium here an expression of God, an extension of the consciousness of Allah, the mighty I am that I am. Even better than that, every person around the world is an expression of Brahma, of Allah, of Dharmakaya as well. Regardless of the religious beliefs and faith, and regardless of the color of their skin, regardless whether they are female or male, every person around the world, every being on this planet is an expression of the divine. And so, actually, you may ask yourself, how come we are all gods, and yet one country is going to war against another? We had a First World War, and we had a Second World War. And even though nobody speaks about a Third World War, right now, in this moment, there are over 30 wars going on around the world. How come we are all gods, and yet our educational system is completely devoid of God? You are basically taught to just use your left brain and to completely forget about your right brain. And you are taught to completely reduce yourself to your lower concrete mind and to forget that you have a higher abstract mind. And on top of all that, right now, there are over 872 million people on this planet who are illiterate, who can't read and who can't write. All it would take is about $10 billion a year to provide global primary education for this planet. That's about half of what Americans spend on ice cream. But how come we are all gods, and yet we are not able to make such a little sacrifice, which isn't even really a sacrifice in truth, to give the gift of education? How come we are all gods, and yet, while the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, and the gap between the two is getting larger and larger? The 3 richest people in this world own more wealth than all 600 million people combined who live in the poorest countries of this world. About 1 billion people on this planet live on less than $1 a day, with about 2.8 billion people living on less than $2 a day. How come we are all gods, and instead that the developed countries, the so-called developed countries, help these billions of people to be able to develop a proper lifestyle, to just have food to eat, to have their most basic requirements for life taken care of? How come instead of helping these billions of people who live in utmost poverty, how come instead the so-called developed countries put so much money into producing weapons and financing wars and even weaponizing space, where about 1 billion people on this planet don't even have access to drinkable water? How come? How is it possible that we are all gods, and that is the reality of our planet today? How come we are all gods, and yet fundamental Christianity teaches that Jesus is the only Son of God? Or how come we are all gods, and yet in Buddhism there is no such thing as a creator God? Or how come we are all gods, and yet there is such a system, there is such a concept as a caste system in Hinduism? Or how come we are all gods, and yet fundamental Islamists terrorize the world in the name of Allah? It kind of reminds of the Crusades of the Middle Ages. So how is it possible we are all gods, and yet there are so many problems in our society today? Well, let's go back to our first question. What is the purpose of life? The purpose of life is not to become God. The purpose of life is to realize God. So, what's the difference? Well, there is a huge difference. To realize God means to make God real in your reality. And to make God real in your reality means thinking like God, and feeling like God, and speaking like God, and acting like God, and demonstrating and embodying God, Brahma, Allah, Dharmakaya, the I am that I am, whatever term you prefer to call your creator, on earth. So if you manage to do that, you're going to realize God. The only question you may ask yourself now is, how?